Good morning.
Good morning.
You all decided that we should start because there was a hush in the crowd, so we will start. So welcome to Building an Equity Culture and Transforming Your Organization workshop. I'm Kelsey, Louie. I'm the proud CEO of Gay Men's Health Crisis, and I'll be your moderator today. We have three distinguished panelists, which I will introduce, and I will proudly introduce. And then I will start off with a few questions for the panelists, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. How does that sound? Oh, good. If you said no, I'm not sure what I would have done. Okay, so first up, we have Andere. Amanda has spent over 15 years working in the nonprofit and public sector as a leader committed to racial equity, social justice, and housing affordability through advocacy for systemic change. Prior to joining Funders Together to End Homelessness as their CEO, she served as the CEO of Wider Opportunities for Women, a national advocacy organization. Currently, she serves as a board member of the United Philanthropy Forum, the James Madison Political Science alumni, and co-chair of Away Home America, a national movement to end youth homelessness. She is also a member of the steering committee for the Campaign for Housing and Community Development Funding. Previously, she served as an adjunct professor at George Mason University teaching nonprofit management. She was also the executive director of Facets and vice president of Cornerstones, who all have similar missions of preventing and ending homelessness and breaking the cycle of poverty. Please welcome Amanda Andere. Next, we have Marc Dones. He's a national leader in equity-based systems transformation. Marc's work has focused on redesigning service delivery systems to better care for vulnerable populations. Currently, Marc leads work across the country helping governments and system administrators transform their work to center equity and improve outcomes for historically marginalized populations. Previously, Marc served as a director of Spark, supporting partnerships for anti-racist communities, where they helped change the national conversation around homelessness to include a racial equity lens. Marc has also launched training institutes for substance use disorder service providers, redesigned violence prevention systems, and helped to lead some of the first statewide work on youth homelessness in the nation. Marc is a firm believer that most things are still possible. Please welcome Marc. These bios are long because these people are really accomplished. Okay. And next we have Osya Miles. A fierce advocate for issues of racial equity, Osya Miles has been recognized as a future leader in the Rochester community. Osya, a trained classical vocalist, began her career as a music teacher in the city of Rochester through the Eastman Community School of Rochester. Her work with inner city youth compelled her to pursue a master's in public administration at SUNY Brockport. Her first role after completing her master's was as a parent educator for the Parents as Teachers program through the YWCA. As a parent educator, she acted as a child development specialist in working with young parents and their children. With an interest in cultural competency and cultural humility, Miles forged a new role at the YWCA focused on racial equity and leading strategic change through a trauma-informed perspective. Her work for the YWCA National Stand Against Racism initiative brought together over 300 participants for a march and rally in April 2019. Osya's commitment as a change agent for equity continues with her development of the YWCA Equity Engagement Series, an innovative collaboration with local organizations to highlight educational opportunities and experiences in cultural humility. Osya sits on the William Warfield Scholarship Board, a scholarship supporting African American classical singers pursuing secondary education. She is a member of the African American Leadership Development Program at the United Way of Greater Rochester. She has been recognized as an upcoming leader by Rochester Mayor Lovely Warren and has most recently been named a finalist by the Rochester Chamber of Commerce for an Ignite Future Leader Award. Miles is a mother of a 10-month-old son, Daniel. Please welcome Osya Miles. So the first question to this very important conversation that we're about to have is, How do you prioritize equity analysis in a work environment with limited time and limited resources?
So I'll start. Hi, everyone. Oh, come on, we need better than that. We're about to talk about some important stuff. I actually want to debunk that question in terms of, like, we have limited time and resources.
Absolutely.
What is more important than focusing on the one thing that's holding us back from producing outcomes that are not predicted by race, by ending homelessness, by addressing structural racism? It's not that we have limited time and limited resources, it's that we don't prioritize and center the right things. So when people talk about we don't have enough resources, I always ask them, you have tons of money for strategic planning, I'm sure, in your organizations. You would never say, we don't have money for planning, we don't have money for audits. You send your staff to the same social work trainings over and over and over again, right? You send people here, and that's all important, but you have resources, you have time, they just need to be focused on the thing that's actually gonna get us to the outcome. And we sometimes other racial equity in our work by saying that we have to do it over here, that it's new, it's not part of what we're doing, and that's part of the problem, is that we need to spend as much time and resources on that as we do on everything else that we have been doing for years but hasn't produced any different outcomes.
I would like to just add on to exactly what you said, Amanda, but just thinking about, when I think about different departments in an organization, would you go and say we don't have enough money for our CFO? You need that, don't you? Do you have enough money for your cleaning staff? You need that, don't you? It is imperative to do this work, to make sure that you have a budget, however you get your resources, somebody dedicated to this work. When we talk about culture, that is not something that you designate to one person. That is not something that you say, hey, we're gonna sit down and have one training on, and then all of a sudden we all have cultural humility and now it's kumbaya. These are structural things that are in our organizations that have been there for such a long time. You need somebody dedicated to it. You need somebody having hands-on. You need to be talking about the barriers, the systems, your regulations, thinking about your culture. That's an investment. And if you're gonna invest in that CEO, you're gonna invest in that director, you invest in somebody to do this work. Yeah, we're sharing mics.
Morning, everybody. I've been thinking a lot. Sorry, I have a cold today, so you're just gonna get what you get, I guess. I've been thinking a lot about, and Amanda heard me say this last week because we do this a lot, but I'm thinking a lot about data and about what we mean when we say we need data, or someone needs to focus on the data, or can someone bring me the data? And I've been thinking about it a lot because so by training, I'm a psychiatric anthropologist. I've spent the majority of my career using data to drive systems transformations, right? And I'll talk about this later today in one of my other sessions, but I ran an initiative called Spark, where we looked at the data around racial inequity and homelessness in 8 jurisdictions across the country. We looked at over 180,000 records in HMIS. We pulled in over 200 oral histories from folks of color currently experiencing homelessness, yada, yada, yada. And used that study to change a lot of state, local, federal policy around like how racial equity was talked about in systemic ways, right? So the fact that the HUD-NOFA asks for disaggregation by race is a result of that work. And I'm quite proud of that. And I also think that it wasn't really necessary. And the reason why I think it wasn't really necessary is because at the end of the day, we'd been told by communities of color, by my community, for years, right? That like there were certain things that disproportionately impacted us. The problem is that it wasn't sufficient to just be told. It wasn't sufficient, right, to be told over and over and over again. Someone had to come along and prove it, right? Mm-hmm. And in the construction of the Spark study, I was very, very, very specific with how the jurisdictions came to be part of that study. There's a reason why it was 8. There's a reason why they were cited where they were around the country. And it's because I was obsessed with this idea of crafting a set of results that were functionally unassailable, right? That like when someone inevitably was like, oh, but you know, where's the rural environment? Or where, you know, you didn't talk to, or, you know, this was all on the West Coast, you know, that I would be able to say like, no, that's not the case. And that paranoia, right, around the idea that someone was going to come and try to tear down this work is the result of a function, right, of racism, which is to gaslight us into believing that what we know is true is not a sufficient reason to change behavior.
Absolutely.
That the only way that we should change our behavior is if, right, someone can show us the data. And I struggle with this because, again, as a researcher, I want us to make good choices. I want us to make choices that are backed by something that makes sense, right? Anyone who works with me for longer than 30 seconds knows that, like, my most frequent question is, like, do you have a plan? Like, I don't, like, if you're talking to me and I've listened to you for 30 seconds and I don't hear a plan, I'm immediately frustrated. I'm not sure why I'm here. I have to go. And I want us to have good plans, but I want us to think really, really critically about like what we are saying when we say that we need better data or that someone has to be able to focus on that data. And I want us to think about whether or not we already have the information we need and we are choosing not to listen to it because of who is providing it.
That biasness.
So if you want to build an organization that like centers equity, if you want to center equity generally speaking, the first thing you're going to have to do is understand that like most of the information is already present. It's just coming from people who you are disincentivized to listen to. So that's what you'd have to change, who you listen to, not what you collect.
That's awesome. So then that just leads me to say, when you're collecting data, or when you're having those conversations, who's sitting at the table? Is it a diverse group of people that are sitting at that table? So at the YWCA, when we talk about different issues with our policies and procedures, we make sure that we're having everybody from different departments, line staff, executive leadership, women of all different ethnicities, sitting at the table, because these are the people that we represent. Making sure you have representation at the table is very important. It's interesting, I was talking to one of my colleagues and I said, you know, how is it possible that I have an all-white executive leadership over the age of 50 making decisions about their average client of 21 to 25, and they're a woman of color with 2 children on average? How is that possible? Why isn't that woman not sitting at the table to tell you, hey, you know, some of these policies are not right. This is hurting me and my family. You're doing more damage. So I do want to thank you, Marc, for that. That was awesome. I do. That's great.
So while we're on the topic of diversity, I want to be very clear about one thing, and this could be the only thing you take away from what I say today. Yeah. I'm worried about the conversations that we're having in our movement because I see 2 things happening being conflated. We're here to talk about building an equity culture, I think specifically a racial equity culture, that is different than diversity. And we have to know the difference. Plantations were diverse. We're talking about power. We're talking about goals towards systems and changing. Diversity is really important, don't get me wrong. I think that sometimes we hide behind diversity for a couple of reasons. We can always say, well, we couldn't find anyone who was this. We don't know anyone. It's really hard to get people to come to a meeting. All of those things get caught up, and I know Marc will talk about this session and probably in the other sessions, around how we change our systems and structures to promote diversity. But I'm here to tell you, if you're focused on diversity alone, you're focused on the wrong thing. And if you don't have diversity in your organization, you can still do this work. You need to do it more authentically by bringing people in who represent the people that you serve. But I don't want people to get stuck in, well, we're never going to be diverse, so we can't do this work. That's false. You have to start somewhere. It starts by understanding your whiteness, understanding your privilege, understanding how white dominant culture rules in your organization, figuring out how the systems and policies within your organization, even if you are a leader of color, lead to lack of diversity, and working on structures and policy and change, not just about diversity in the room. So I want to be clear about that because often I represent funders who probably are the worst people to be talking about diversity and building stuff on racist structures, but they're trying, and that's why I'm here. But I've noticed something when we go to site visits and we ask people about racial equity, and they give me answers around, well, we serve a lot of black people. That's not it, folks. It's not it at all. And I don't want to spend this whole session explaining why it's not it, because it's part of your work is to do the work. Part of your work as a person of color within your organization is to not do the work for other people, to let them do the work to understand the difference between that, so they never answer a question like that again. Mm-hmm. And I just want to, I should have started with that, but I think it's really important to know the difference, to name the difference when we're talking about diversity and inclusion, and when we're talking about equity and policies and systems and structure. And they kind of go like this, but we have to know the difference. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So thank you. So Marc, I just wanted to let you know that I have a plan, okay? Amanda, something you said reminds me of a phrase that I heard a few weeks ago, which is that the carriers of the disease known as racism and prejudice is often the systems in which we work. Mm-hmm. And I think some of the things you said kind of reminds me of that, so thank you for that. So as you can see, in just minutes, you are getting a lot of great information. We started to talk about this, but I was hoping that we could flesh this out a little more. How can we promote the lived experiences of marginalized groups as legitimate institutional knowledge that informs our current practices?
Yeah, I'll start. A couple things. So I'm going to talk a lot about this afternoon, about how you build a system that does that, and what process you can go through. So I don't want to give that talk now, but what I will say is it's really, really important that we understand that it's precisely what Amanda's saying, that like a system of power, right, has embedded in it a lot of sort of binary moments, actually, where it decides like this thing is or is not valid, right? So if we're going to think about how we center those experiences, we have to redesign those systems to recognize those experiences as valid points of information and to then draw on them. Some of that stuff is really banal, and like it need not be rocket science, right? So like, for example, if you have job descriptions, I assume most of them are like, you have to have 7 years of experience and 10 JDs and 45 masters. Like, there's no reason why you cannot write your job descriptions to also incentivize, right, like folks with lived experience from historically marginalized communities to do that work, right? And like I run a firm, all of my job descriptions, right, I eliminated all year requirements. I don't ask for those, right? I say you have to have deep expertise. You have to have a proven track record. These are all questions I can ask you without saying you have to have done this for 45 years. It's really, really simple to put in your job description, I am looking for people, right? Like people with lived experience are encouraged to apply. This includes experience of mental health, experience of homelessness, like you just list the things, right? And then when people see themselves, they are actually encouraged to apply. But then you have to actually build an organization that's capable of, again, recognizing that when folks show up, they have knowledge that comes from those places that isn't from inside an institution, but is from their life, right? And saying, like, that is also a way to contribute. And in fact, right, we want that. And one of the things that we often talk about is we, like, you know, in this conversation in diversity is, like, we also talk about inclusion, and we just sort of say them together a lot. We're like, oh, these are our diversity, inclusion, equity initiatives. Drives me a little bit crazy. That acronym spells die. That should have let you know immediately that this ain't it. Sometimes the medium is the message. But, right, like, so diversity, Amanda's right, like, diversity ain't it. Inclusion starts to have a conversation about how do people show up as themselves, right, and be honored and expected to show up as themselves, right? So I am a queer, non-binary black person in America. I have a lot of other things going on. I have a dog, I have a partner. All of these things inform how I do my job, right? My staff does not expect me to lead from a place that is different from that at any point in time. So, like, I will be in a staff meeting and we will be talking about a client. I'll be like, they can catch these hands. I don't give a shit. Because that's who I am. And it's real, like, I'm not going to change who I am, right?
You meant a client like as an organization, not a person.
Not a person,
okay.
Yeah, sorry. I work with governments. So if you are a government, you can catch these hands.
This is what
I want to see this.
Right. But, like, I think it's really important, right, that, like, there are other folks on my team who come from a very different orientation, and they need to, because I'm gonna come from that one. That's how we work inclusively, right? Is we make sure that the space that we're crafting and creating allows people to show up in their fullness and to understand that that fullness is in part, right, like, what makes them good at what they do. So again, when I talk about, like, what is the data, or, like, well, how are we saying, like, what does it mean to have the right information, what I'm really asking us to do is to go on an epistemological journey about, like, what is information, right? And again, how do we build systems that do or do not validate information when it comes from certain places? Acknowledging, right, that at the core, all information is information. It's just what we decide about it that determines what we do.
From a personal standpoint, operating in these organizations, personal accountability goes a long way. So checking your biases, looking at yourself internally. I come from the standpoint, at my job, we talk about cultural humility, meaning that, yes, I am an African American woman, but we are not all the same. We all have our individual characters, things that we bring to the table, and that's okay, and that should be accepted. You know, sometimes, I will tell you, sometimes I wear blonde hair, sometimes I wear braids, sometimes I'm just, that's just who I am, but I should also be accepted, but I'm also checking my biases to say, listen, when somebody walks through that door, it's okay for them to have their truth. They can still show up and do the job. That's okay. And I can still show up and do my job. So when we're talking about those structures, is it okay for us to show up and do what we have to do for the agency to better the agency, but also realizing that in an inclusive situation, we should all be accepted, and making sure that being equitable does not necessarily mean fair. It's leveling the playing field.
So from a practical standpoint and from a perspective of funders and how you can have a relationship with your funders, I want to give some advice that I'm sure people here hold as a value, but I don't think we can say enough. Outside of staff, who we should pay well, when we're thinking about including the voices of lived expertise, we often create environments where they are paid with soda and pizza. No more. We have to pay people for their time and for their expertise and value it at the same rate and level as the person who has 20 years of social work experience.
Can I do the math on this?
Yeah.
So let me be real clear. If you invite someone to speak on a panel because they are a person with lived experience, with some CEOs who make over $100,000 a year, right? Divide that by 2,080 to get to the hourly rate, and then pay that person what those people make an hour. We are not doing a $20 gift card. We are not doing a Starbucks card. Like, pay people what you get paid. I can't do this. Unless you get paid in pizza, don't pay nobody in pizza.
So, yes.
You're doing pretty good for being sick, yeah.
So that means if you're a funder, you have to think about how you are funding in that way and what questions you ask your grantees. If you're a fund seeker, if you're a grantee, you need to start having those conversations with your funders. And I'm not saying taking away from your existing grant, saying we need additional resources, because to really center people with lived expertise, we have to pay them. And the conversation goes both ways. The other thing that I hear happening, or I see happening, is that we feel like we have to train people with lived expertise to be in our spaces. No. As the keynotes, as Jason said, the humility, the intimacy, the gratitude, we need to realize that we practice adultism. We practice otherism. We need to be trained how to show up these spaces and actually embrace people that are different from us. So stop with the training of people how to show up and live in white dominant culture in meetings. You have to train yourself how to unpack all of that. And I'm not just talking to the white people in the room. We are all oppressed by white dominant culture, including people of color. And we have to unpack that and untrain ourselves in that behavior. And that takes resources as well. So those are the two practical things you can do. Pay people and stop telling people how they need to show up in the room.
Great. So to continue along those lines, I think the next question actually we started to discuss, but I just wanted to make sure that we address specifically how, given all this, how do we move towards a more equitable power structure within an agency?
The first thing I'm going to say is explaining to everybody that works in your agency what equity is. I know that's a no-brainer, but what is equity and how does that work in our organization? Whether it's a huge organization or a small organization, what is equity and what does that mean to us? And where is it in our strategic plan? It needs to be an investment. Like, I go back to the same thing. You invest in that CFO, you invest in your CEO, you should be investing in equity.
You can go.
I've been talking a lot about power lately, and thinking a lot about it. I mean, frankly, we all have way too much power in our organizations. We are gatekeepers, right? If you are a provider, you are a gatekeeper to resources, to housing, to services. If you are a funder, you are the ultimate gatekeeper, right? But if you're an advocate or you do policy work, you're also a gatekeeper to who gets to use their voice, who gets to be at those tables, who gets to make those decisions. So I think when we think of ourselves as gatekeepers and unpack what we are holding back, we can start to figure out how we shift power. But a lot of times, I think we need to have a reckoning that we, even those who are people of color, who sit in organizations, are afraid to give up power. And why we're afraid to give up power, and what does that mean? I don't know all the answers, but I know it has to start there. It has to start off with a reckoning of our power, how it's influencing our organizations, and examining internally in our organizations, asking the question, why do we do this? Does it serve us well, and who does it serve well? And so that is where we start in terms of power. Also, sometimes I think in our work, as much as we love our power, we're afraid to admit that we need power. And that's because a lot of times human services, housing is put in this position of this charity mindset, this humility without substance of that power is actually what changes things in our systems, and that it's important for people to have, but how do we share it? So I want us to start doing that reckoning internally within our organizations and start to have those conversations about who has power and why we defer to some people, as Marc was saying, and we don't defer to others, and just have that reckoning internally.
So, a couple things. One, in terms of structure, if you're trying to build anything that's equitable, you need to think about flatness as a model, right? So you need to be realistically designing towards people being able to access power, right, when they need to leverage it, and not to move through like 1,001 layers of hierarchy to get to decisional points, et cetera. Flatness is not, I mean, like, how do I say this politely?
Oh, we're all friends.
Flatness is antithetical to two things, right? It's antithetical to white dominant culture, and it's also antithetical to as Amanda was pointing out, this sort of scarcity myth that we've put ourselves into. When you operate out of a sense of scarcity, you get something and you hang on to it, and you're gonna kill somebody who comes for it, right? That mindset around power means that we don't design towards flatness. We always end up in command control style organizations. When command control actually is, it is a style of leadership. It is useful in very specific situations, right? And like the organizational design science on this in theory is quite clear. Like, unless you are running an emergency or rapid response style administrative function, you actually don't need a command control style structure. You just don't. So like, literally, unless you are like, in 30 seconds, I have to be able to deploy to save somebody or to do this thing. I don't know why you've designed an organization that looks like the military.
Yeah.
It's very confusing to me. I'm glad that the cold medicine is working.
Yeah.
So design towards flatness and be like, really like, think it through, right? The other thing that I would say is, and this is again related to what Amanda was saying, but we need to shift away actually from advocacy, and remember that like our core functions are actually in two places, right? So if you think about, there's organizing, there's advocacy, and there's service, right? Service is what we all talk about what we do, right? We're like, I'm serving the downtrodden. Jesus. And
There's nothing wrong with Jesus.
I know there's nothing wrong with Jesus. I'm Jewish, and I feel like there's nothing wrong with Jesus, and Amanda's not. Amanda's very Christian. That's one of our ongoing relationship paradigms. I get frustrated, right, when people are like, I am Jesus, because I do this work.
Yes.
That's what I'm pointing out, right, is like, no, like, you get paid, sis. So like, Jesus ain't make no money.
Right.
So long as you are making money, you are not Jesus. Okay. So there's service, right? And service is we just do what people need, not because we need somebody to tell us it's good, not because we need a pat on the back, not because we need a paycheck, because it is important to do. And there is organizing, right, where we say, look, really, right, like, people have power, and like, we need to be working with communities who have been historically marginalized to help them build that power so that they can speak for themselves without us, right? The death of me will be the hybridization of service and advocacy. These two things should not touch. You advocate for those who cannot speak. Unless who you are serving cannot speak, they don't need your advocacy, they need your organizing.
Right.
I am sick to death of seeing, right, people sit in rooms, sit at panels, and say, I represent the so-and-so. Who asked you to represent them? who will you return to at the end of the day and be accountable to? Who will be able to say to you, this was the wrong decision? This was the wrong decision for our community. Because if it's a funder who can say it and not someone who is directly impacted, then you are not actually, right, connected to that community in a reasonable way. And you are advocating in absence, right, of who you ostensibly are speaking on behalf of. And the creation of these hybrid service and advocacy organizations has made it so that people experiencing homelessness, black folks, brown folks, trans women, never speak. Right. They are spoken for, often by people who they wish wouldn't speak for them.
Right. Absolutely.
So if we want to build equitable organizations, right, that means that like you flatten out, you hire the people, you pay them, and then you go away. Let people speak for themselves, direct resources towards the things that they think are important, right? But do not continue to do this thing where you show up on behalf of folks who don't know your name.
Right.
So, I've been floating this idea. Got a lot of criticism last week.
You're going to do great.
But I'm just going to say it again because I am really tired of conferences. Shout out to all the organizers of this conference. I know it's a lot of hard work. I'm fiercely emailing my staff about our conference in July. So I'm speaking.
Complicit.
Yeah, I'm right. Yeah, enabling and complicit and speaking, preaching to myself. But part of the power dynamics we've set up are these structures of conferences where we sit up here, everyone listens to us, and we're not actually in community listening to people and figuring stuff out. I'm sure some people are tired of hearing my voice, maybe not you all, but other people have heard me say the same thing over and over and over again, and like, oh, Amanda's gonna say this, and still don't do anything about it. I would like us to actually have time where we bring people together or go into community and get rid of the power dynamics and the structure of these conferences where we don't actually get work done.
Absolutely.
Because we're not sitting in community and hearing from the people we actually need to hear. We don't feel like we have to talk or have the best presentation or PowerPoint. That is not serving our movement well. It's just not. And that doesn't, now hear me well on this. Don't go back and say, Amanda said, although she did, that, that we shouldn't have any conferences. I actually think the scarcity model feels like we can only do one or the other. We could probably do both.
Yeah,
Of course, absolutely.
But I also want to make sure in our conferences that we're serving the movement and the people we say that we want to change their lives and the power dynamics well. And I don't see year after year going to conferences changing structural racism. And so I would like us to think about how we undo these conference experiences. And that doesn't mean, like, let's just have panels where we do, like, flashy things and make people, like, uncomfortably talk to each other if they're an introvert and bring in
Trust falls are terrible.
and bring in fun games. Like, it means creating environments that are co-created by people with lived expertise, that get rid of the power dynamics, that says, like, I'm not an expert in anything. Amanda's not an expert in anything. I was just chosen to lead an organization. I'm trying to do the best that I can to bring realness because I first show up as a black woman in this space, not a CEO. So I'm trying to bring the realness, but I actually don't know anything. And I don't know the solutions, and we need to get rid of the power dynamics that have us up here, you all down here, and then the people with lived expertise, where are they?
Absolutely.
Where are they?
So this is what I challenge you all to do. This is your call to action. Because we can come up here and we can talk and we can tell you how to, but it's very simple. Go back to your agency. Form a group, a committee. No, form a group. Bring those people, whoever you serve, into a room and just listen. It's so simple, but so hard, right? Having conversation and being open to listening to their stories. Rochester had a huge problem with that, I will tell you right now. We definitely had a problem. I mean, our whole entire highway system was built on racist practices and everything else. You could drive out of the city, you can hit on a highway, and you can get to Pittsburgh, and you can live in your nice multi-million-dollar home, and you never had to see poverty, and then you can hop back on the expressway. You gave the resources that you thought were okay, and then you got back into your car, and you drove back to Pittsburgh. That's Rochester for you, and we're still trying to dismantle a lot of the practices that we have going on. But what I will say is what we did do right was eventually people said, how are you making decisions for people that you know nothing about? I'm not even gonna, some of you guys have eaten from Wegmans? Maybe? Some people from Rochester? Rochester. Wegmans.
I like Wegmans.
See, Wegmans is really good, but let me tell you, it is really good, and I love Danny. I think he's great, but do you know he makes up a lot of the decisions that we have in Rochester due to his funding? Danny's probably never come to my agency where he sees a lot of these young women struggling day in and day out, transportation barriers, DHS. He's never sat in any of those rooms, but guess what he does? He makes those decisions. Get into your agency. Sit down. Don't talk. Unless you're asking, how do you feel about it? Why? What do you need? Empower. But don't tell their story.
So thank you for that. One of the signs of a great panel discussion is when the panelists answer your next question without you even asking it. I think given some of the calls to actions and some of the ideas here and some of the words, I think now might be a good time to invite questions from the audience so we can start to build community, at least in this room, and to have a dialogue. Does that work for everybody? Yes. Okay, so I invite you to please think of some questions. There's a microphone in the middle of the room, and thank you, we have our first volunteer.
Hey, I just wanted to add another thing for folks. So if your organization is a corporate sponsor, try to get some of those perspectives in this room with the free tickets that you get. That's the only reason why I'm here as an underemployed autistic advocate right now, for example. And so the question that I wanted to pose to you all is, I think, equity, as Marc kind of alluded to, definitely needs to include people with disabilities. I completely get what you were meaning by saying, unless people can't speak, don't speak for them. And at the same time, as an autistic advocate, I can say that so many times, folks who are non-speaking, who don't always use speech to communicate, and I'm including myself in that, people do kind of claim that they're speaking for us when we still can advocate for ourselves. We still have things to say, even if we're primarily non-speaking, and you're nodding because I can tell you're totally agreeing. And so I'd like to, hear how you're incorporating people with disabilities into this work that you're doing, and especially multiply marginalized disabled people. So like disabled people of color, for example.
Mm-hmm. I think, so I can talk about this. Well, I can and will because it's already in my slides. I will talk about this afternoon when I talk about how to work with community to do systems design. What I will say now is I'm trying not to give too much away. What you need to do is. So most of the time when we're trying to do work in the sort of homelessness or housing space, we often default to the HUD categories when we're thinking about how do we engage with people, right? So it's people will be like, I need to talk to the families, or are the family advocates, or I gotta make sure the vets are engaged, right? My team uses a different classification schema, right? So we talk about folks who are overrepresented in the population experiencing homelessness, and we talk about folks living with disabilities, trans folks, particularly trans women, black folks, and Native folks, right? And refugees. And so those are the groups that we target as part of our, what we call a progressive engagement strategy, which is, again, I will talk about this afternoon. It's based on a respondent-driven sampling method. But basically, like, you find folks who are in those communities and work with them inside a community-based participatory either research or design process so that you are co-creating, right? And Amanda alluded to this. This is the sort of foundational tenet of what my work is like you co-create with the communities in order to identify, like, you know, what are the things that we should be doing, et cetera, et cetera. So I 100% agree. I also think that, like, you know, not for nothing, like, lots of nonverbal folks, for lack of a better term, sort of vote with their feet, right? And so folks make choices every day about where they're gonna go or not go, right? And so if you've got an agency and you're like, oh, we never see anyone with any disabilities here, well, that's a problem, right? Because, like, it's not that people aren't getting services somewhere, it's that they made a choice that you don't do anything that they find useful, right? And so, like, I absolutely agree that, like, folks, there are a lot of ways, when I say speak, I think there are a lot of ways to speak, and it's about being attuned to what that speaking is for whichever community you are trying to listen to. Thank you.
Good morning. So it was mentioned that you know, sometimes agencies, people hide behind diversity. When you have people on the ground floor that may be working with the service users that they are people of color, but in upper management, you really don't see that diversity. So my question is, should the conversation and should what agencies do, should it shift from promoting diversity to combating white supremacy? And if so, how would that look different?
Oh.
I mean, yes.
I mean, essentially, yeah.
We can do all the things.
Yeah,
Right.
I mean, like, I think, like, so one, I think that, like, it's important to define terms, right? So, like, when we talk about white supremacy, we're not talking about, like, wearing a KKK hood and, like, burning a cross in your neighbor's lawn. We're talking about, I mean, you could do that, and that would be a white supremacist act, but that is not what white supremacy is, right? White supremacy is it's a result of structural racism, and it's the system that lends privilege and power to white people, and, right, it leads to an internalized feeling of superiority in white folks, right? And it's the merger of all those things that we can consider white supremacy. And there are a lot of ways to unpack that I don't have time to do right now. But what I will say is that when you focus on addressing white supremacy, to Amanda's point, and I'm sure that she'll say this, what you begin to do is unpack what white dominant culture is, right? And as you unpack what white dominant culture is, and begin to do that work around breaking down, right, what are the ways in which our organization or our mindset, right, is operating in that way, you naturally, frankly, wind up being able to consider other kinds of expertise and other kinds, right, like, outside of white dominant culture. So, for example, right, like, a thing about white dominant culture is the written word, right, and, like, the fact that, like, the best way to communicate is to write me a memo, right? That's a very white dominant culture thing. And so oftentimes what we see is that folks advance not because they have a particularly brilliant skill set, but because they, like, wrote a lot of good memos about some stuff, right? So, like, but, like, other people have maybe even better ideas, right? But, like, didn't write a memo about it. So, like, when we move away from white dominant culture, we suddenly are able to see and understand that, like, there are other forms of knowing, other ways to know, other ways to be brilliant, that we should be moving up in terms of hierarchy, if we're going to do a hierarchy, which, again, I think we should think about that. The other thing that I would say, no, it's two things. So the second thing I would say is it's really important to think really, really, really carefully about whether or not advancing is also managing, right? So because we overuse command control style business architecture, we think that advancement is synonymous with management. A lot of brilliant people should manage nobody.
Right.
Nobody, right? should be paid more, should be held up as brilliant, should be sent to all the things, right? And should supervise nobody. Similarly, right? Being a great supervisor doesn't mean you know anything. It means you supervise well, right? You do good check-ins, you're really good at being like, hey, what do you need, right? Like, how do I manage this barrier for you? That is a skill set. It does not necessarily equate to being an organizational leader. Those are different functions. And so, like, we think that the only way, because, again, command and control, is, like, that in order to advance, you have to be like, I have 75 direct reports, and, like, you know, like, which is, ugh. I have 4, and it's horrible. And so, like, I really think it's important that we understand that, like, those are different things. And so when we're looking for folks and saying, like, oh, I really want to promote Amanda, but I think she'll be a terrible supervisor, promote Amanda anyway. Figure out a different supervision model. And then finally, like, the last thing that I would say is that almost every direct service agency that I've ever worked in, encountered, coached, audited, whatever, always has like one person who's like a frontline staffer who they think, you know, the sun shines out, typically her behind, right? And they're like, oh my God, like, you know, this case is so hard, but then we sent it to Mary Beth, and she's just so good. She solves every problem. She's so good. And then you talk to her, and she's typically a woman of color, and she's like, I've been in this job for 25 years. And it's like, that's very confusing to me. Because if we send you all our hardest problems, and you have every relationship in this community to manage all those problems, plus, and you know where every skeleton is, every body's buried, right? And we put you on stage at every fundraiser, and you've been here for 25 years, why don't you run it?
That's true.
Okay. Thank you.
So, do folks know, has anyone done the white supremacy, white dominant culture worksheet? Just Google white dominant culture. A lot of stuff comes up. But there's tons of stuff. But there's a worksheet that goes through the different characteristics of white dominant culture, from perfectionism to sense of urgency. We have them, we're a virtual office, so we all work from our homes. So I have it in my home office. We post it in our Slack channel. So whatever you use, a practical step is to start to hold that in yourselves and in your organizations, and constantly look to those things and call out when you're doing them. Because the white dominant culture, the white supremacy, is what leads obviously, as Marc alluded to and said better than I did, leads to the lack of diversity, leads to the lack of power. But I realize we're talking about white dominant culture, we're talking about white supremacy, and folks might not know those things. And I think we need to take the time to sit with those things and call them out. Because I do it sometimes too, like the worship of the written word, or just the perfectionism. Like, I feel like things need to be perfect. So when you if you're a visual person, or you just reflect on them every morning, I will not be a white supremacist today, because I will not worship the written word. To look at those things within your organizations and start to unpack them and call them out. And hold folks accountable in your organizations for those things, so you can start to get at, why does the leadership look the way that it does? Why do we hire people of color and they don't want to stay? Why do I feel like this is the first time I'm able to be my authentic self as a Black woman, and I've done this work for a number of years? So that's part of the work, and that's what we need to begin with, is really to understand white dominant culture and to bring it in front of our organizations and our agencies.
I will say, as you start to unpack, sometimes we get so into our feelings, where our emotions and stuff, we still need our jobs, okay? So don't go into your office and be like, listen, please don't do that. Please don't, because if you do that and you lose your job, remember, we're still dealing with emotion. And there are a lot of people that are biased, and there are a lot of people that don't want to hear it, because then that means that they have to be honest and say, this is truth. Go with a plan. Have your allies. Make sure when you're about to approach it from fact. Your numbers and your statistics say that you only have 10% minority folk, but you serve this. Make sure you have an action plan and a way of how to solve it. Oh, hey, HR, maybe we should, in our job descriptions add this is what we're looking for so we can attract people. Better yet, where are you going when you are tabling or when you're looking for people for a diversity? Or not, I'm sorry, well, when you're looking for, a diverse group of people. Where are you going? That's important. But please don't go into your boss's office and start going off on them. I know you want to, but the way to getting this work done is to make sure that you have your facts and everything together before you go.
Counterpoint. I am the CEO of an organization. I run my own firm now. I own that firm. It's wild. I don't know how I got here. But I do know that this journey that I'm on started with me 6 years ago, walking into my then very white male boss's office and being like, literally, what the fuck? Because everything was very broken, right? And right, I called my mom ahead of time and I was like, I may be fired today. That is a thing that may be happening today. I might do this and I might be calling you immediately afterwards, talking about I'm gonna hop the train home. Can the dog stay? But right, I think it's really important to recognize that at the end of the day, yes, I lined up my ducks, I did as much as I could, but at the end of the day, I was still walking into a white man's office to say, you run a racist organization, and you've got me out here talking about anti-racism work, but this organization is racist, so what's the plan, right? I think, to your point, perhaps, at the end of the day, one of the things that we need to all reckon with is, do I want to work at a white supremacist organization? That's a yes or no question. It's not, do I want to work? It's, do I want to work at a white supremacist organization? And I'm not, out here being like, well, jobs grow on trees. You can just get a new job.
Right.
But I am saying that, sometimes you got to make a call, and that call might end in this ain't great. I think it is, to me, it's disingenuous to not say that's part of it. Right. It's you will court danger and you're gonna have to.
I just want to say one thing. If the people who fought for my right and liberation to be here thought about their own safety and their comfort, I would not be here. We have to put ourselves on the line. We and you do. So I don't want white allies, I want co-conspirators. That you put as much on the line as I'm putting on the line. And so I don't want you all to lose your jobs, but you have to be able to give up something in order to get liberation.
Absolutely.
And you have to be able to give up something in order to get justice. And so to the white bosses in the room, do not fire people because they're using their voice and they're telling you how they feel. That's actually the problem, is that folks in power, and myself included sometimes, people come to us with problems with how they're feeling, and we take it personally, and we don't look at systems and structures, and we overuse our power. We have to get past that. So put something on the line today, folks. That's when you know. When you feel nervous walking into that meeting, when you feel like I could lose something today, that is actually doing the work.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, we have totally taken away from your time to take this question.
Another sign of a great panel discussion is when there are different viewpoints and different strategies, so thank you.
Yeah.
So next question.
No, all of yours was a great lead up to what I was going to ask. My name's Martha. I actually work for New York City government. My question is about hiring in New York City government. Thank you, Marc, for raising the question about descriptions, job description. So my question, which I'll have to now modify a little bit, New York City has strict rules around hiring, and for lots of reasons. Where's the place to push when there are many stakeholders interested in keeping the status quo? Many stakeholders, not just so I work for I work for a social service city agency.
Is it DSS? Do you just work at DSS?
Yeah, I work at
Okay.
Speaking of putting, make yourself vulnerable. So I work at DSS, and we're looking to hire people for, but I have to stay within particular rules, which limits who I can reach out to, limits who can be hired into jobs, and limits the likelihood of people with lived experience being able to take those jobs.
Yep.
So suggestions on where to push and thoughts from people on that.
Yeah, I mean, so a couple things, and I'm going to be very specific about this. DSS has recently made a number of commitments. You have a new commissioner who came, or relatively new commissioner who came out of legal aid and is an interesting guy. Steve Banks, yep, Commissioner Banks. And you also have recently, I think right under your first deputy commissioner, like there's a position for equity and inclusion, right? So I think that there's a high level, like written down commitment as an agency. That's the first step, right? Is like once something is written down, and this is what I used to do all the time before I just was in charge, but I'd be like, you wrote it down. And I am really having trouble. I'm trying to do what you wrote down. And I'm really struggling. And so, like, honestly, like, I think that's always a good place to start. But then the other thing that I would say is, like, and this, it's been a while since I've done, like, deep work in New York City, so forgive me. But I would also be looking, because the big win wouldn't be a DSS policy. It would be, like, New York City, what's the human resources? Yeah, so it would be a DCAS win, right? And so if you can begin to have this conversation internal to DSS and say, like, look, like, bottom line is, like, New York City is, like, majority folks of color at this point, and, right, we know that we have these structural issues. We know that we need to be pulling in folks from community in order to drive forward, and we also are aware that we're not, right? That currently that isn't what's happening, and we have all these high-level written down commitments to do these things, right? So rather than take it agency by agency, like a good old interagency task force, right? to pull together like a set of policy changes that would allow you to shift how you could prioritize things inside that structure would be my principal recommendation. But the other thing that I would say, and I think that this goes to sort of the question of strategy, is that you also want to be prepared to point to systems that have done this and have seen wins because they have done it, right? And so what you should do is just a quick scan. I mean, like Healthcare for the Homeless has done this. They're a HRSA-funded program, right? But there are a number of programs that, through mandates or significant policy changes, begin to actively incorporate into leadership positions and policy-setting positions folks with of the communities that were impacted, that have radically accelerated their efficacy over the last 5 years. So you really just need like 5, right? Maybe last 3, that you're like, look, like it works. And then I think that like the wheels of administrivia, right, start to turn because they're like, oh, I love to be evidence-based. I'm very, like, so that would be my recommendation on that. Sorry for everyone who's looking for something more general, but I don't know if that's helpful. Okay.
Next question.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right. I'm Jimmy. Thank you all for some inspirational ideas, but I feel like you mostly focused on how to kind of inspire leaders and change leadership structure so far. So I just wanted to hear your opinion on how to change workers, kind of direct service workers, maintenance workers situations on the ground. You mentioned that people should get paid fairly, which I really appreciate, but something more concrete. And I have a reflection to end with. People working for the city tend to have unions, they tend to have pensions. People that work for nonprofits oftentimes don't. That's where I want to.
So I work for a non-for-profit. I don't have a union. And I go by this model, an unexpected leader. An unexpected leader is not the typical leader that you see in this hire. Anybody can be a leader, right? If you have those qualities, you can get together with whoever your colleagues, and if there's something that's not right, go back to the books. If you're talking about pay equity, do your homework, do your research, and bring it to your supervisor. There are different ways that you have to do it. It doesn't always have to be top down. When I started moving up, I was an unexpected leader. I was not supposed to be in the position that I am. To be honest with you, I made my own position and said, hey, this is what you need. And I sat in front of 2 white women that were over the age of 50, and I typed it up, because you know they love their memos. I typed it up, and I said, this is what's going on in your organization. Your mission says to empower women and eliminate racism, but some of the practices that you guys are practicing are racist. I did it in a nice way. I want to keep my job, okay? But I was honest, and I had that conversation. And then I became that middle person for those line staff people to say, Osya, you know what, this is what's going on here and it's not fair. Okay, let's go back to our policies. Let's go back into our procedures. It might not be fair, but we need to have that conversation. So I'm gonna challenge you. Just because you're not a director, a CEO, that's okay. You still have that leadership in you to gather people together, and if something is not right, you can call them on it. You're protected. Speaking from a non-for-profit person that does not, like I said, I do not have a union, but I do have my voice and a plan. So.
I hear you, and I appreciate you bringing that up, and I think sometimes we focus on leaders because we know leaders are the ultimate gatekeepers to these discussions even happening within organizations. And I'm just reflecting on, you know, what that does even in these conversations about othering the dialogue. But I meant what I said about allies and co-conspirators. While I want people to put something on the line, I think that white staff members can put more on the line in order to open up those conversations. And so there is a responsibility of the white staff members who might be the folks who might be the case managers or the folks not in leadership to put something real on the line in terms of thinking about how do we co-create an environment to have these conversations so the people of color don't always have to be the ones raising their hands. So we don't have to constantly be re-traumatized in these conversations by knowing that sometimes it will take many efforts to get people to listen to us. So that's sometimes why we lean towards leaders, but I do think other people have a role. And I just want to be honest and candid. I want to think more about how we think about, I think reimagining our structures, having flatter structures, will get to this dynamic where we don't have leadership in the way. But until that happens, I'm going to talk to leaders because you all are the gatekeepers to even having these conversations. When you say, we're going to talk about racial equity, but we're only going to spend 3 hours of it during an all-day staff meeting. When I say you don't put the resources in. So right now in our current systems, it is up to leaders to start to realize how they are the gatekeepers to these conversations even happening. And they need to start to listen to all staff and really listen and ask them, do you feel like you can show up as your true self? What are you seeing with the people that we're working with? What are the barriers? So I think it lies in both places, but it has to start with leadership in our current structures.
I don't have much to add. I think to me it's just organizing, right? I want to see folks at all levels focused on organizing. And so if you're a frontline staff person, I think you should be focused on organizing, not just with other frontline staff. I think you should be focused on organizing with the people that you're trying to serve, right? And trying to make sure that they are able to build power in their community to advocate on their behalf, or for themselves, I should say, rather. I think, if we take that fundamental orientation of we should all be focused on organizing, then immediately around us, those options become available. And in fact, right, if the discussion is around union, which is, I would at some point love to have a conversation about the future of the labor movement because it's interesting. But if the conversation is about unions as a particular vehicle, then that's an organizing opportunity, right? I've seen some interesting organizing that's been done where folks experiencing homelessness have formed a union-esque kind of body, right? So again, I would say that if you focus on that as the principal methodology, then that's organizing is for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Next question.
Good morning, y'all.
Hey.
Y'all hear me? I talk a little low. Okay. Well, I'm Gaviko. I'm one of the youth board members for the New York City Youth Action Board. Yay! Thank you. Yes, thank y'all for inviting us, by the way. As youth, like y'all said this before, but I just wanted to reiterate and reassure for those that may be in the room that as youth, we kind of do feel the tokenization of our presence in spaces that we've been invited to, because we do recognize the inadequate pay. And we recognize the ageism, especially in the spaces where we come there, because a lot of the saints like to use a lot of vocabulary that goes above our heads. But then asks us how we feel, we're like, what? So I guess like for youth that are in these spaces, like, do you have any particular tips or like strategies that we can use to help like change that dynamic, especially when we go into those spaces?
Good question.
I will say, I feel like I'm kind of on the younger side, because I am.
So do I,
Right.
for the record.
And I do. And I have a lot of those challenges sitting in the room, first being a young woman, but then a young woman of color. And yes, exactly to what you said. Sometimes they have all these large terms. It kind of goes over my head sometimes, or I'm on my phone trying to look stuff up. And I'm like, you show up as yourself, and you show up knowing that you did the work and that your voice matters. First, it starts with confidence. I'm gonna tell you, you gotta fake it until you make it, honey. And that's what I do when I sit at those tables. But when there is an issue that I know that I have a passion about, I'm able to speak about it. And I'm able to speak eloquently about it, and I'm able to state my thoughts, and it's okay. Sometimes you also have to call them to the table and say, listen, you know what? Your practices are not right. The day is turning, we're turning. The workforce is gonna be women and minorities very soon, the majority. So they have to open up their eyes to that, and that's okay for you to bring that to them. I'm just speaking from experience, being in that situation and being kind of on the younger side. It's okay to be there, show up, sometimes listen.
I'm gonna speak out of your tradition briefly, if you don't mind. There is a sermon that I think about quite a bit called A Seat at the Table. Have you seen this? And it's a sermon that talks about, I'm not gonna preach at you. But it's a sermon that talks about considering deeply, right, like why you have been invited to the table before you accept that seat. And I think what actually is coming to me right now is that a lot of times, right, when we're invited to tables and then tokenized at those tables, we do ourselves a disservice by continuing to show up and by legitimizing that table with our presence, right? And so one of the things that I have actually advised a couple youth boards to do, particularly around YHDP, is don't sign off on it. Right? Like with Youth Homelessness Demonstration Project dollars, right? Like there's a HUD requirement that you have a youth action board that sign off on what you're proposing, right? I've spoken with a number of YAB members around the country who have said like this process actually wasn't a process, it was tokenizing. Like basically what they did was a bunch of adults came up with a plan and then called 2 meetings and told us that like it was a good plan and we should say that we approved it, right? And I've said, don't approve it. Like, don't let your presence become, right, like how people use us, continue to use us, right, to drive forward strategies that we don't actually feel are for our communities. So that's one thing, is just like, don't, like, just say like, I'm not, right, I'm not doing this. The other thing that I would say is, don't feel compelled to speak, because that I think is the other thing, right, is like we get pulled into these rooms and people are like, and you know, and it'll be like, oh, like, you know, we need to talk about equity.
Stay very silent.
And I mean, like, when I have something to say, I'm gonna say it, right? But like one of the things that I think that like, you know, if the conversation has proceeded in a way that I either just tacitly don't approve of, or, right, like I actually don't have anything to add, I'm not going to, again, lend my voice to this moment to be like, oh, everybody's doing a great job. And then the third thing that I'm thinking is just, in relationship to all of this, I would say it's really important, particularly for folks from historically marginalized communities, broadly speaking, not to become reduced to our story, right? So I have quite a bit of experience with things. I have my own pretty significant mental health stuff. I've been hospitalized a few times, et cetera. It's not relevant to my job. I don't need to discuss it unless it becomes relevant. What is relevant is I've worked in policy for a decade, right? That's like, that expertise is why I'm in the room. And so I think the last thing is just really, truly, right? Like, don't conflate your experience or your story with what you know or why you know it, but rather, right, like, allow who you are to inform how you know, right? But don't become reduced to that. And I think it's really, really critical as we more and more invite folks with lived experience and invite young people into the space that we're not saying to them, if you accept this invitation, who you have to be for the duration is a story. That's so harmful, right? So I just really want to, I want to make sure that we're not thinking of including folks with lived experience as like, I'm just going to sit there and listen to them tell their story, and then I'll make the decisions about what's salient in it. That's profoundly harmful.
Thank you. And I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you for talking about flatter hierarchy structures. I think that in New York, or at least in my organization, it's really management is the only way to move up. And I'm hoping that maybe you could give us some examples of agencies that have used flatter hierarchy structures and like concrete ways to push for that.
Yeah. I mean, like the tech overlords, everyone wants to trip over themselves to worship, predominantly use flat structures. Google has a relatively flat internal structure. Facebook and Amazon both have a relatively flat structure internally. Like, all of these multi-billion-dollar, corporations that act like nation states that we spend all of our time worshiping, all use flat structure. Most of them have also all abandoned traditional accreditation as a way of hiring, right? So like, Google does not care if you have a degree. They care if you're a brilliant engineer, right? They don't even care if you're like, as we all have seen in headlines recently, they don't care if you're social. They don't care if you're racist or not. They care if you're a brilliant engineer, right? And so, and they'll test you on it, right? They will absolutely, you will sit down, you will code a thing, they will stress test that code, but if you pass, you are hired. They don't care if you have a high school degree, a JD, it doesn't matter. I don't know why Juris Doctorate is on my mind today. But, so that's one thing, right, is I think we really ought to, if we really mean what we say we mean, I think we need to eliminate degree requirements and year requirements and really isolate the skill set we're looking for and then figure out how to test for it in our hiring process. I think that, generally speaking, so how my organization is structured, and we're in the process of, restructuring every 4 seconds because we're young and, that's how it works. But we think about teams rather than departments, and teams have leads, but that lead is not responsible for managing people. That lead is responsible for project managing, right? And those are different. So the lead is responsible for being able to tell me when I come around, what's the plan here, right? And are you on target? And that's the conversation we have, not Bethany is not hitting her KPIs, right? That's not what we do, right? So, but you can think about structuring teams that have goals and have a PM for that team who you might pay slightly more for that task, but it is slightly more, right? The pay range at my firm is all within about $20K. Nobody is just making a bajillion dollars more than somebody else for being in a management position, right? And we have set up a structure that is really, really focused on making sure that what we actually think about when we look at someone and their work is this work integral to the performance of the firm, right? And the answer for everybody should be yes. People shouldn't be doing stuff that isn't actually important to do, right? So if I'm looking at what somebody's doing and I'm we can take it or leave it, right? I don't know if I need that position. And that's a different conversation, right? So that, I think, is how you get to flat structure, is you really do a functional analysis of like what needs to be done, like what's integral, you home those things with different people, and you acknowledge that the administrative work is just as important as the program direction. Because if the administrative work isn't happening, guess what? The program doesn't work. So those jobs they are mutually critical, and so need to be paid the same and treated with the same level of respect.
Thank you. Anyone else on that topic? So in the last few minutes, what I would ask each of you is if you have any brief closing remarks, maybe something that you didn't get a chance to say, or something that you would like to leave everybody with.
So I will say, we're all looking at each other like, just make sure that your work is intentional. Racial equity is intentional. It's not something that, well, we just kind of do when we feel like it. We'll give it to this person that kind of seems interested. It is so intentional because these structures that are here were placed intentionally. So do the work, listen, don't tell anybody else's story. We all have our own stories. That's all I could say.
Thank you.
I'm gonna be talking a lot this afternoon, so I'm good. But I will say that, like, if you want to have a deeper dive on either the data or like sort of concrete strategies around implementation and sort of what that looks like, I would encourage you to swing by both of my sessions in the afternoon, because that's what they're going to be on. If you choose not to come, I will remember your face and know that you didn't come. No, I'm kidding. No, I will say, if I don't see you again, I will just say that, like, this is critical work, and it is not by accident that between 60 and 70% of folks experiencing homelessness in this nation are people of color, right? Homelessness is majority folks of color, so it's absurd that we have to fight for space to have a conversation about race, right? And we will not fix a race-driven problem, a problem that's driven by racist systems, I should say, right, with race-blind policymaking or race-blind programs. So we really have to be having this conversation and then building intentionally out of those conversations in concrete ways.
Thank you.
We will not undo hundreds of years of structural racism in one workshop, in one conference, in one meeting, in 1 year. So part of the work is not only intentionality, but realizing the time and the persistence and pervasiveness we need to have into this work. This work will not be wrapped up in a toolkit. It won't be wrapped up in one idea or one policy. We have to learn and unlearn, learn how we got there, unlearn those practices, and realize that this is a 50-year liberation journey, maybe even 60 years. So don't come to these meetings asking, what are we gonna do next? Don't be so disturbed by what you hear that you just want to fix it. I don't trust you to fix it. I don't want you to fix it. I want you to learn how we got here and work with people in community to unpack how we got here and start to change that direction, and that will take time. So be patient, be persistent, but really understand that this is long-term work.
So I want to thank everybody who decided to come to this session. I think it says something in and of itself, the fact that you're sitting in this room today. So thank you. And I'd like to thank Amanda, Marc, and Osya for your words of wisdom. So let's give them a round of applause. Thanks. And I'll leave you with, don't forget that I consider myself part of the youth movement. Thanks.